Ready to practice VTP just a little? Well, I've set you up with Packet Tracer with VTP pre-configured, both to use it and to not use it. Your job is to try to create those VLANs and see the differences when you are using and are not using VTP. Let's do it. So here's what I want you to do in this lab. Think about this topology. All the switch-to-switch links are already pre-configured, so they're trunks. And you've got 4 PCs down there at the bottom, but your job is going to be to configure some VLANs and observe the behavior as impacted by the pre-configured VTP settings, all right? So in the Packet Tracer file that you'll use for this lab that's linked in the description of this show, the top part, you're going to see the topology at the top and the bottom. And the top part, VTP has been configured, and dist1 and dist2, the D1 and D2 switches here are pre-configured as VTP servers, and the bottom 2 are pre-configured as VTP clients, all right? Then in the bottom, all 4 switches are VTP Transparent, meaning VTP isn't in use, so it's going to work like you normally would have been thinking about in your other CCNA studies, all right? So what we're going to do is have you try the same things in the top and the bottom and see the differences just to learn about those differences. So what do I want you to do? You take the topology and you use the top topology in the Packet Tracer file to do this. And here's what I want you to do. Just as an exercise, configure VLAN 101 on the upper left switch, 102 on the upper right, 103 on the lower left, and 104 on the lower right, and observe what happens. All right, now you might be able to sit there and predict some of what would happen based on your knowledge of how VTP works, and that's great, but you can observe it. When I demo the lab, you'll see it there as well. Then once you've attempted one VLAN each on each of the 4 switches, then come back to step 2 and just ask yourself, hey, if I wanted all 4 of these switches configured on all 4 of these VLANs configured on all 4 of the switches, how would I go about doing that when I am embracing VTP and using server and client modes? You figure it out, make the VLANs appear on the 4 switches, all right? So that's the VLAN configuration part for the VTP top topology. You should continue and verify a few things. Show interfaces trunk to confirm that all those links between switches are trunking. And then you should look at show run or show run pipe to include VLAN to see if the VLAN commands show up in the running config or not. All right, that's one of the key differences between when you use VTP and you don't. And also you should look for those VLANs in the show VLAN brief command output as well. All right. That's with VTP on in the top topology. And then you basically repeat the same steps in the bottom topology where all 4 switches are configured to use transparent mode. So configure VLAN 101 on the upper left switch, 102 on the upper right, 103 lower left, 104 lower right to observe what happens. And then at step 2, ask yourself, how do I get all 4 of these VLANs configured on all 4 switches? How do I set about doing that? That one might be a little more obvious even, but even if it's not, noodle through it, figure it out, or watch the demo part of the video and I'll show it to you. Then once you've configured it, circle back, do show interfaces trunk just to confirm that all the trunking links really are operating as trunks. Check out show run to see if you can find the VLAN commands there in this case or not, and show VLAN brief to confirm all 4 of those VLANs really are there. Last bit, if you want a little bit more to look at, some extra steps, you can do this both on the top with VTP and bottom without VTP. Try to configure VLAN 2222 from the extended range of VLAN IDs and see what happens. And maybe do that on switch D1, all right? Then another test is try to configure the no VLAN 101 command, again on the upper left switch in each topology, D1, to delete VLAN 101 and see what happens. In fact, you can even look at switch A3's list of VLANs. Is switch A3's VLAN list impacted by the deletion of a VLAN? And finally, here's a few show commands that you might want to try just to see what's out there that might reveal something about how VTP works. All right, those are your instructions. Clearly, you're going to need to circle back and hit pause at a few of these to help guide yourself through things. The Packet Tracer file is linked in the description, so you can download that, open it up, pause the video on the pages that tell you the steps to do and go about doing the lab. And here's the spoiler alert. Next thing up for me is to begin demoing the lab, so be warned, you're about to hear more about the lab answers in just a second. Now the steps in lab say to configure VLAN 101 on D1, 102 on D2, 103 on A3, 104 on A4. So we'll do that, and I'll use the VTP in use part of this packet tracer file, so it's pre-configured, and I'll show you some evidence of that starting out here. So let me scoot that over here. And if we just go ahead and get into privilege mode, show VTP status here on D1, and we can see that it is indeed operating as a server mode. It's in domain Cert skills, for instance. All right, so it's in VTP server mode, so config T VLAN 101, and the command is accepted. And if we get out of config mode and do a show VLAN brief command, we see VLAN 101 is indeed configured, just as you would expect, and just as would have happened before you even thought about VTP, right? But now if we get back over here to switch D2 and open up its console and do something similar, maybe create VLAN 102. First off, before we do that, let's just do a quick show VLAN brief command, and notice we already know about VLAN 101, right? Because it was learned with VTP, it turns out a quick show VTP status confirms that D2 is also a server, and it's in domain Cert skills. So it learned about VLAN 101, but the lab says, hey, try to configure VLAN 102 over here as part of the opening steps. So VLAN 102, there you go, and show VLAN brief. Now D2 knows about those two VLANs, but did say D1 also learn about it? Well, let's repeat that show VLAN brief. And indeed, with VTP, it learned also VLAN 102. So you might guess now we go down to A3, what's going to happen there? Well, it's one of the two VTP clients, so the behavior should be different there, right? So we get into privilege mode, show VTP status, just to confirm it is a client switch, also in domain Cert skills. So it should reject the VLAN command, right? So config T VLAN 103, and lo and behold, we get this error message that says, hey, we can't do that while in client mode. So it's rejected, but we can confirm that A3, a VTP client, learned VLAN 101 and 102 from the previous action. And finally, here on A4, we can try to configure VLAN 104, but you can probably guess the outcome now, right? So we get here, config T VLAN 104, it's rejected, but we still see evidence with show VLAN brief that it learned the two that were indeed configured up there on the two servers. Next, the lab says, hey, figure out how to get all four of these VLANs configured on all four of the switches. And with VTP in use, we just have to go to one of the servers like switch D1 or dist1 and configure those other two VLANs that we tried to configure on the clients, but they were rejected. So we just do a VLAN 103 and a VLAN 104, one after the other. We've created the two VLANs, and that should have created them. If we do a show VLAN brief there, we see all four of those VLANs here on D1, but say if we went back to A3, one of the clients, and up arrow the show VLAN brief, there we see 101 through 104. So indeed, all we had to do is create them on the servers, and the information is propagated. All right, for broader verification, remember VTP, the messages should only flow on trunks. So you could go around to the different switches and do a show interfaces trunk, which shows only trunks. And here on switch D1, it shows we're on switch access 3. It shows the two trunks that you should have noticed from the topology diagram, one each to D1 and D2. And then if we were to pop back up to switch D1, for instance, show interfaces trunk, we see three trunks. Those are the three trunks, one connected to D2, one connected to A3, and one connected to A4. So you could work through those methodically if you wanted to and confirm that trunking was enabled and operational on all the links between the switches. However, the most unusual and unexpected thing to come across is that when you do a show VLAN brief, you see those 4 new VLANs, but then if you do a show running config command and look around, you don't see them. Like, they're not there, and they're not there, and they're not there. And I know that VLANs, the commands, are normally shown up near the top of the running config output. But if I were to do an up arrow and then use this pipe to include the word VLAN, there's only one mention of it. It happens to be in a spanning tree command as a parameter, but there are no VLAN global commands that create VLANs. So the running config doesn't have any of the VLAN commands in it because we're using VTP. For the second part of the lab, we're going to look at the transparent switches, the bottom ones in this topology. So if we click on D1 and open up the console and get into privilege mode, we can get in there and try to create VLAN 101. Now this is a transparent mode switch, so the VLAN 101 command should work. There it is. And a show VLAN brief command should show VLAN 101. But because we're not using server and client mode, say if we go over to D2 and get into it, show VLAN brief, it didn't pick up VLAN anything else. Here, let me widen that out just a bit. We don't see VLAN 101 because there's no ability to dynamically advertise those VLANs. But to follow the lab, it says now let's try to create VLAN 102 over here on D2, and we do. So it does show up here on D2. If we do a show VLAN brief on D2, DIS2 if you will, but D2 for short, there's VLAN 102 on D2. If I go back to D1, we see only VLAN 101. So of course, we're not using VTP for its intended purpose, so we're not distributing VLAN config information. Just to follow the lab one more step, if we get into switch A3, and again, configure a VLAN 103 in this case, and go look at the list, show VLAN brief, 103 is created. So the long story short is, with transparent mode, you've got to configure all the VLANs on every switch, and I'm not going to keep doing that. So what we want to do next then, according to the lab, is figure out how to get all 4 VLANs configured on all 4 switches. Well, you just got to configure them all. So I'm going to do that here. Just give me a few moments to type all that in. VLAN 101, 102. I think we've already got 103 here, so we'll do 104. So we've got those. Go back to D1. Back to D2. And then A4 was one that we hadn't done anything with yet, right? So config T, VLAN 101, 102, 103, 104. And now if we were to go around to each of the switches, show VLAN brief, we'll show all 4 of those VLANs. So it's a bit laborious, particularly if you think you've got hundreds of switches that you have to configure all these VLANs, and you might think, oh my goodness, well, what you're going to do if you're doing this and you're adding 10 VLANs, you're going to type them in, a text editor, copy and paste them in, or use some automation to configure those, for instance. But you certainly aren't going to run around, typing over and over and over on those. Next, the lab asks you to confirm the different trunks that are in use. So you could do commands like show interfaces trunk, and see here on the access switch, it's got 2 ports that are trunking. If we go back to switch D1, show interfaces trunk shows us it's got 3 trunks, but because we're not actually making use of VTP, we're not using server and client modes, it doesn't really matter if trunking was in use, but it is. So in both cases, both the upper that's using VTP and the bottom that's avoiding using VTP, all the links between switches are trunking. It also suggests that you try to find those VLAN commands in the running config. So here up on D1 still, let's just do a show running config and see if we can see them. And I don't see them there on the first page, and I look a little further, don't see them there. And we've got these different VLAN commands, but here we've got 4 different VLAN commands in the config right there just above the interface ID list just before the halfway point in the running config. So there's a confirmation that, hey, you've got the VLAN commands in running config because we're in transparent mode. And while I've just told you we're in transparent mode, here's a show VTP status command that indeed confirms that the switch is in transparent mode. And of course, we've seen with show VLAN brief that now each of the 4 switches know about the 4 VLANs we wanted them to know about because I just typed in all the commands, right? So that's how they were learned. So the lab suggested a few other things you might try. So let me walk through a couple of those at least. So if I go up to the top where we're using VTP and get into dist 1, it says, hey, try to configure an extended mode VLAN. All right, so we get into config mode and it's suggested VLAN 2222. So let's do that, and we get an error message that basically says, hey, extended VLAN's not allowed in this mode. All right, so we're rejected there. Whereas if we go down to the topology where we're using VTP Transparent mode, get into config mode, VLAN 2222, it's accepted. If we get out of config mode and do a show VLAN brief, it should appear. There it is down there at the bottom. Now notice it's at the bottom, so you have to look at it below all those pesky ones that aren't usable, but you can't delete them 1002 through 1005, but there it is down at the bottom of the list. The other thing the lab asks you to do is check out what happens if you try to delete a VLAN, like in both the top and bottom. VLAN 101 exists. So if we go back to D1 from the top part of the topology and say no VLAN 101, well, it seems to be accepted. Locally on D1, we do a show VLAN brief, and VLAN 101 is now missing from the list of VLANs. Then if we go over to say A3 here, another switch, and do a show VLAN brief, because it's using VTP as well, it's also missing from the list here on A3. Point being, because they're using VTP, it propagates the fact that VLAN 101 is deleted. And that's kind of the beginning of the danger, right? Hey, you can make that as a mistake and delete VLAN 101 everywhere. And likewise, if you hook up the lab switch that doesn't have VLAN 101, or an attacker hooks up a switch that doesn't have VLAN 101, you can delete that VLAN throughout your network. It's pretty powerful danger, and that's one reason why people avoid using VTP. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like a little bit more, if you click on the left, you'll move on to the next topic in sequence, which is about VLAN troubleshooting. But this is a lab video, so if you want a little more depth on what we just talked about in this lab, watch the VTP video that's linked over there on the right. Hey, thanks for spending time here. I'll talk to you soon.